humanity encountered the Galactic Empire and burst out laughing. Part 1. The ships appeared without warning on a Tuesday. Not slowly, not dramatically, not with any of the build-up that every science fiction movie had promised us. 1 second the sky above Earth was normal. The next second, 4,000 warships were hanging in orbit like ornaments on an invisible tree, each one so enormous that their shadows moved across entire countries as the Earth rotated beneath them. I was in the middle of reviewing a budget report for the United Nations Environmental Division when the alarm went off. My name is Marcus Webb. I am, by every reasonable measure, not the kind of person who should be anywhere near a moment like this. I process paperwork. I organize meetings. I once spent 3 days arguing with accounting about whether a stapler counted as a capital expense. And yet, somehow, when humanity made first contact with an alien civilization, I was sitting 12 feet from the window that had the clearest view of the lead flagship hovering over New York. The thing was the size of a small continent. It was also shaped, unmistakably and without any possible room for misinterpretation, like a novelty USB stick. The kind people kept on their keychains, slightly tapered at one end, rectangular body, a faint ridge running along the top. My colleague, a very serious woman named Carol, was standing beside me with her hand pressed over her mouth. I thought she was going to cry. Then I realized she was trying not to laugh. I was not trying very hard at all. The broadcast came 12 minutes after their arrival. Every screen on Earth, every phone, every television, every digital billboard in every city switched to the same image at the same moment. A figure stood in the center of a vast chamber. It had 6 arms, skin that glowed faintly blue-white at the edges, and a face that was almost human except for the eyes, which were solid gold and the size of oranges. It wore something that looked like a cathedral had been turned into a garment. Behind it, rows and rows of identical armored figures stood in absolute silence. A voice came out of every speaker on Earth simultaneously. It was deep and resonant and genuinely impressive. I will give it that. People of the third planet, it said, in accented but perfectly clear English. I am the eternal herald of the sovereign dominion, speaker of the 600 proclamations, voice of the unending throne. Your world has come under the notice of the galactic dominion of the eternal sovereign. You are hereby given 72 hours to submit unconditionally to dominion authority, surrender all military assets, and prepare your population for integration into the Dominion Labor Registry. Failure to comply will result in the complete erasure of your civilization from the galactic record. There was a pause, apparently for dramatic effect. You may now express your surrender. The transmission cut out. For approximately 4 seconds, the uncrisis room was completely silent. Then Carol said, very quietly, "Their flagship looks like a USB drive." The room erupted, not into panic, into laughter. 17 senior officials, 4 generals, 2 heads of state who had been patched in remotely, and a very confused intern who had walked in carrying a tray of coffee. All of them laughing. The Secretary General, a dignified woman named Patricia Ockafer, who had never once in my presence made anything resembling a joke, was pressing her knuckles against her lips and shaking with suppressed amusement. One of the generals, a broad-shouldered man named Colonel Harris, recovered first. He pulled up the radar data and stared at it. "Their arrival triggered our Eastern Seaboard Missile Defense Grid," he announced, "classified as large migratory birds." That set off another round. I stood at the window and looked up. Through the glass, past the ordinary blue of the midday sky, I could just barely make out a dark shape, vast and still, hanging where nothing should be hanging. And I felt something strange. Not fear exactly. More like the feeling you get when something is so far outside your normal experience that your brain simply refuses to process it as real. Like standing at the edge of the Grand Canyon for the first time. Your eyes send the signal. Your mind says, yes, yes, I see it. And then it says, but that cannot possibly be what it is. 4,000 ships, each one larger than any city on Earth, a civilization that had presumably crossed the unimaginable distance between stars to come here, and they were giving us 72 hours. The Security Council convened within the hour. I was there because my boss had evacuated the building, and I happened to be the next-ranking official in the room. This is how history works sometimes. Not through grand appointments and chosen heroes, but through who happened to miss the elevator. The debate that followed was, to put it generously, very human. The first argument, lasting 22 minutes, was about whether the alien arrival technically constituted a weather event under the current international insurance framework. This was brought up by the delegate from a small northern European nation and was, somehow, not immediately dismissed. The second argument was about translation liability. If we sent a response and it was mistranslated, who was legally responsible? The third argument, and this is the one that nearly broke me, was about whether the 72-hour deadline was meant in Earth hours or some form of alien time unit, and whether asking for clarification would appear weak. I raised my hand and said, I think we should ask them what they want. Everyone looked at me. Specifically, I said, I think we should open a communication channel and ask them to clarify the terms of their ultimatum, in a polite way, and maybe ask if they have a written document we can review. The Secretary General looked at me for a long moment. Mr. Webb, she said, are you volunteering? I was not, but I said yes anyway. The alien communication channel took our technicians 40 minutes to establish. During this time, someone discovered that the Dominion's broadcast music, the solemn and intimidating soundtrack playing under the Herald's speech, was either an extraordinary coincidence or the single funniest thing that had happened in human history. Carol ran an audio comparison. The alien theme was, note for note, structurally identical to a famous piece of music from an animated film about a talking donkey and a green ogre. We never found out if this was deliberate. We never asked. When the channel opened, the Herald appeared again. This time it seemed slightly surprised that we had established contact so quickly. It had probably expected panic silence or a formal military broadcast. Instead, it got me, in my slightly wrinkled suit, sitting in front of a camera with a cup of coffee that I had forgotten to put down. Hello, I said. I am Marcus Webb, representing the United Nations of Earth. We received your message. Before we respond formally, we would like to request a written copy of your terms. Also, a clarification on the time frame. Are those 72 Earth hours or a different unit of measurement? The Herald stared at me with its enormous gold eyes. It said nothing for 11 seconds. Then it said, you are requesting documentation. If it is not too much trouble, I said. Another pause. Your designation is warm-bred uncertainty, the Herald said finally. Its translator had apparently decided that the name Marcus Webb was best rendered as a food-adjacent emotional state. You are aware that noncompliance results in the erasure of your civilization. Yes, I said. We just want to make sure we understand all the details before making any decisions. It is standard procedure. The Herald looked at me as though I had said something in a language it did not have a word for, which, in a way, I had. We will provide documentation, it said at last, in a tone that suggested it was saying this the way a person says something when they have no idea what else to say. The channel closed. Carol leaned over. Warm-bred uncertainty, she said. I know, I said. That is actually a lovely name. I know, I said again. The documents arrived 6 hours later. They were 3 meters tall, written in an ink that appeared to be some kind of bioluminescent compound, and detailed in extraordinary length the terms of Dominion authority, the history of conquered worlds, and the benefits of compliance, which were listed as continued biological existence, access to Dominion labor programs, and the honor of contributing to the eternal sovereign's legacy. We printed them out. We put them in a binder. The binder was labeled by the intern submissions folder. Somewhere above us, 4,000 warships waited. We made tea and started reading. Part 2. The delegation that boarded the Dominion flagship 3 days later consisted of 7 people. Patricia Acaffer, Secretary General, walked first because she was not willing to let anyone else have that particular moment. Colonel Harris walked second because someone needed to be armed, even though the aliens had very clearly stated that weapons were not permitted, and Harris had technically left his firearm at the checkpoint. He had, however, smuggled in a multi-tool and seemed satisfied with this. I walked third. The remaining 4 were specialists, translators, and one woman named Dr. Olivia Grant, who was a behavioral psychologist and had spent 20 years studying how different cultures communicate stress. She was the calmest person in the group by a significant margin. The shuttle that brought us up was theirs. It arrived silently, docked with the roof of the unbuilding, and opened a door that smelled faintly of something between pine trees and electrical burning. Inside, the seats were enormous and designed for beings considerably larger than us, so we sat in them the way children sit in their parents' armchairs, feet not quite touching the floor. The ascent took 9 minutes. The flagship was called, according to the documentation, the eternal sunrise of unending power and boundless dominion over all who look upon it in reverence. Patricia had taken to calling it the morning bus. I had taken to calling it the USB drive. The intern, who had not been invited but had sent us off with a bag of snacks that turned out to be extremely important, had called it Dave. We entered through a hangar the size of a small city. The scale was genuinely difficult to process. I kept expecting to see people moving at normal human scale and kept realizing that the tiny figures I could see in the distance were not people but machines, and the machines were already enormous. The walls were carved with scenes that appeared to be historical. Battles, processions, worlds rendered in submission. Everything about it was designed to make the viewer feel small. It worked on me for approximately 30 seconds. Then Colonel Harris leaned over and said, very quietly, "The carvings on the left wall show what appears to be a solar system being absorbed into a machine. Looks like a cement mixer." Olivia Grant made a sound that was technically a cough. The herald met us in a chamber called, according to a plaque outside the door, the Hall of Eternal Judgment and Cosmic Reckoning. It was a large room with a very high ceiling and very dramatic lighting. The herald stood at the far end, flanked by 2 rows of armored figures, and watched us walk the length of the room with the full weight of 10,000 years of galactic authority pressing down from its expression. Patricia walked to the exact center of the room, stopped, and said, "Thank you for having us. Lovely space. The ceiling detail is extraordinary." The herald's left eye twitched. The proceedings began formally. A Dominion official read out what appeared to be a 40-minute recitation of the sovereign's lineage and military achievements. Our translators caught about 70% of it. The parts they missed seemed to be honorific titles. The parts they caught included references to 340 conquered civilizations, 11 destroyed star systems, and one occasion where the sovereign had made a species go extinct simply for being aesthetically displeasing. We listened politely. Olivia was taking notes. Harris was looking at the structural joints of the ceiling. I was eating a granola bar, which in retrospect was probably not the diplomatic choice, but we had been awake for 31 hours and I had forgotten I was holding it. The herald noticed the granola bar. It looked at me the way a person looks at something they have never seen before and are not sure they want to continue looking at. "You are consuming nutrients," it said, during the rite of cosmic presentation. "I apologize," I said. "Would you like one? We brought extras." Dead silence. "No," said the herald eventually. "They are quite good," I said, and then Patricia gave me a look that ended the conversation. The formal ultimatum was then presented in its complete version. The Dominion wanted Earth's full resources, its population integrated into labor programs, and all military technology surrendered within 30 days. In exchange, Earth would receive the status of protected Dominion territory, which came with the benefit of not being destroyed and the honor of existing within the sovereign's registry. Patricia listened to the full presentation. Then she opened her folder, took out a single sheet of paper, and said, "We have reviewed the documentation carefully. Our counterproposal is as follows. You withdraw your fleet to a distance of at least 500,000 kilometers. We enter a period of independent diplomatic engagement, 60 days, during which both parties exchange information and discuss terms. At the end of 60 days, we negotiate a formal agreement, or we do not. No preconditions, no labor integration, full sovereignty retained throughout." The Herald looked at her. "That is not," it said carefully, "how the Dominion operates." "We understand," Patricia said pleasantly. "We are suggesting it operate differently in this instance. You are a species that has not yet achieved faster-than-light travel," the Herald said, as though this explained something very basic that we had missed. "Correct," Patricia said. "We are very new at this, which is exactly why we would benefit from a proper negotiation period rather than an immediate decision on terms we have only just received." I watched the Herald. I had studied its face, if face was the right word, for 3 days of video footage. Its expressions were not human, but they were readable in the same way that you can sometimes read the mood of a building by how the people inside it are moving. And what I read in that moment was something I had not expected to see. Confusion. Not anger, not contempt, genuine confusion, like a person who has played the same card game for 1,000 years and has suddenly been told by a newcomer that they have been misreading one of the rules the entire time. A recess was called. We were escorted to a waiting room that appeared to have been furnished based on the Dominion's best guess at what humans would find comfortable, which meant it contained chairs of the right size, a table, and absolutely nothing else, not even a plant. Harris immediately began examining the ventilation system. Olivia sat down and opened her notebook. Patricia stood in the center of the room and was quiet for a moment. "How do you think it is going?" I asked. "They expected panic or fury," she said. "They have neither script for calmness nor script for counteroffers. We are forcing them to improvise, and whatever their chain of command looks like, improvisation is not part of it." "Is that good?" I asked. "It is interesting," she said. "Interesting is usually good." During the recess, something happened that none of us planned and that changed the trajectory of everything that followed. One of the younger members of our delegation, a 26-year-old translator named Ben, had been live messaging updates to a colleague back on Earth. The colleague had, without asking anyone's permission, shared these updates on a public forum. Within 4 hours, the entire negotiation was being followed in real time by approximately 200 million people. Commentary was running at full speed. There were reaction videos. There were people dissecting the Herald's expressions using facial recognition software. Someone had already created a digital recreation of the granola bar moment. We found out when Ben's phone, which was supposed to be off, buzzed 40 times in a row. Patricia looked at the screen. She read several comments. Her expression did not change for a long time. Then she said, "The granola bar has its own fan account." "I am sorry," I said. "Do not apologize," she said. "This might be the best thing that has happened today." Back in the Hall of Eternal Judgment and Cosmic Reckoning, the Herald returned with a new posture, slightly stiffer, slightly more careful, as if it had received instructions from somewhere above it and was now navigating them with some internal discomfort. It announced that the Dominion was willing to extend the response window by 15 days. It was not willing to withdraw the fleet. It was not willing to enter a negotiation period without prior submission. Patricia thanked it warmly, said we would take 15 days to consult with our governments, and asked if we might trouble them for return transport to the surface. The Herald said yes. We left. In the shuttle on the way back down, Harris said, "They're armored guards in the hall." Did anyone else notice that they were not breathing? We all looked at him. "They were decorative," he said. "Statues, very good ones, but statues." Olivia wrote something in her notebook. "They brought statues to a negotiation," she said, "to make the room look more intimidating." "Yes," Harris said. She wrote something else. "Fascinating," she said, and she sounded like she genuinely meant it, in the way that a person who has studied behavior for 20 years means it when they see something they have never seen before. We landed on the roof of the building. The intern was there waiting. He handed us all cups of tea and asked how it went. "They are confused," I said. "Good confused or bad confused?" he asked. I thought about the Herald's left eye, the twitch that had appeared during the granola bar and had not entirely gone away. "I think," I said, "that they are the kind of confused that comes from having spent a very long time being certain about everything, and then meeting something that does not fit the pattern." The intern nodded seriously. "So what do we do now?" I looked up, past the rooftop, past the ordinary evening sky, at the dark shapes that were not stars. "We find out," I said, "what makes them laugh." Part 3. 15 days is a short time to figure out how to deal with 4,000 warships. It is, however, a surprisingly long time to get creative. The blockade was technically not a blockade. The Dominion fleet had not moved to encircle the planet in any formal military configuration. They had simply parked, which is a word that carries a different weight when you apply it to continent-sized warships. Satellite communications were intermittently disrupted because the ships were in the way. Some weather patterns shifted because the shadow coverage was affecting solar radiation at the surface. A shipping lane near the east coast had to be rerouted because one of the smaller escort vessels, which was still the size of a large city, had drifted into it. In the absence of any formal military engagement, and with the negotiation window technically still open, humanity did what it does when placed in a situation that is terrifying but not immediately lethal. It started making things up as it went. It began with the satellite issue. Our communications engineers, working out of a facility in New Mexico, discovered that the Dominion ships were broadcasting on a frequency that, with minor adjustment, our equipment could piggyback on. They were not broadcasting anything sensitive. It was closer to ambient signal, the kind of noise a very large electronic system puts out the way a building puts out heat. But it was there, and it was strong. And within 48 hours, Earth had quietly used the alien fleet as the world's largest and most unintentional relay tower. The Dominion did not notice for 4 days. When they did notice, they changed the frequency. Our engineers changed with them. This happened 6 times. On the 7th time, the Dominion simply left our frequency alone, apparently deciding that the effort of blocking it was not worth the energy cost. This was our first small victory, and we celebrated it with the particular quiet satisfaction of people who have gotten away with something. The second development was the fear broadcast. The Dominion had, among its many psychological tools, a device that projected a low-frequency signal across a planet's surface designed to induce a state of generalized dread. It was subtle, the kind of feeling that settles into the back of the mind like a cold draft. According to Dominion records, later shared by Velharath, it had been used successfully on every species they had ever encountered. Everyone. They had simply turned it on over Earth within the first 72 hours and expected it to quietly do its work. What they had not accounted for was the state of the average human nervous system in the year 2147. We had been through a lot. We had been through several hundred years of documented history that included an extraordinary range of catastrophes, recoveries, near extinctions, and returns. By the mid-22nd century, the baseline anxiety level of the human population was, according to at least one epidemiological study that became briefly famous after the invasion. Already operating at roughly the intensity the Dominion's fear device was calibrated to induce. The device was like pouring a cup of warm water into a hot bath. Nobody noticed. What they did notice was the frequency itself. A music producer in London named Donna, who had been working with experimental sound design for 15 years, picked up the signal on specialized audio equipment. She described it as having an unusual rhythmic underpinning. She spent 2 days filtering it, layering it, adding a bass line and a melody structure borrowed from a genre of music that had been popular in the early 2020s, and published the result on a music platform under the title Alien Interference. It was the most streamed track in the world within 72 hours. There were remixes, there were dance videos, there were covers. A very elderly man in Portugal played it on an accordion and received 40 million views. The Dominion was, by all accounts, baffled. On day 6 of the 15-day window, the first of the supply incidents occurred. The Dominion fleet relied on automated logistics drones to move supplies between ships. These drones were functional, efficient, and entirely unguarded by any kind of meaningful security protocol, because in 340 invasions, no species had ever thought to interfere with supply logistics during a negotiation period. It simply was not done. Nobody had told us that. Our engineers had, by this point, developed a fairly solid understanding of the Dominion's communication signals, enough to identify the frequency the drones operated on. A small team, working entirely without authorization from any senior official, wrote a patch that inserted a minor redirect into the drone routing system. The redirect was not large. It added a single delivery stop to 17 drones on a standard supply run. The stop was the Dominion flagship. The items delivered were sourced from a warehouse in New Jersey that had been donated to the crisis response effort. 40,000 rubber ducks, individually packaged, each one with a small sticker on the bottom that said "Property of Earth, please return." The drones deposited them in a cargo bay on the eternal sunrise of unending power and continued their route. We found out that the delivery had been received when a transmission came through on the open channel. It was not from the Herald. It was from a lower-ranked official, and the message was very short. "What is the purpose of the yellow objects?" it said. I was the one who happened to be on communication duty. "They are gifts," I said, "a gesture of goodwill." A long pause. "They make a sound," the official said. "Yes," I said, "that is part of their design." The channel closed. Colonel Harris was standing behind me. "How long before they figure out it was us?" he asked. "They already know it was us," I said. "The question is what they do about it." What they did was nothing, not because they were amused, but because they had no protocol for it. 4,000 years of galactic conquest, and not one of their rule books covered the situation where a pre-interstellar civilization sent them novelty bath toys during an active planetary occupation. On day 9, someone found an IKEA flat-pack dresser, still in the box, in a supply drone intended for the secondary communications vessel. The assembly instructions were included. They were in Swedish. On day 11, a single wheel of Parmesan cheese, approximately 1 meter in diameter, appeared in a drone headed for the fleet's medical wing. It was wrapped in paper and had a handwritten note attached that said, "Enjoy this, signed Earth." Nobody claimed responsibility for any of it. Patricia pretended not to know. Harris pretended to investigate and found nothing. I suspected the intern but could not prove it. The Dominion's response when it came was a show of force. On day 12, they selected a small asteroid in the outer belt, well away from any inhabited area, and destroyed it. The explosion was visible from Earth with the naked eye. A brief transmission accompanied it. "This is the power of the Dominion," the Herald said. "This demonstration should clarify the seriousness of the situation." Someone live-streamed the asteroid explosion. It got 11 million viewers in the first hour. Comments were uniformly enthusiastic. People described it as beautiful, spectacular, and the best fireworks show in recorded history. The donation link for a children's educational charity, posted in the stream description, raised over $3 million before the stream ended. The Dominion was informed of none of this. But on day 13, something happened that I had not planned and had not expected. I was reviewing communication logs when an unscheduled channel opened. It was not from the Herald. It was from a vessel identification code I did not recognize, a smaller ship near the outer edge of the fleet. The voice on the other end was different. Younger, if that translated across species lines. More careful. Warm-bred uncertainty, it said, using my translator name. I am requesting an unofficial communication. I sat up straighter. Go ahead, I said. My name is Velharath, the voice said. I am a secondary logistics coordinator on Fleet Vessel 12. I am contacting you without authorization. I understand, I said. I will keep this between us. A pause, your species, Velharath said. The things you have been doing, the yellow objects, the music, the cheese. Another pause. Why? I thought about how to answer that. Because, I said, we do not really know any other way to deal with something frightening except to find the part of it that is also a little bit funny. It helps us think more clearly. The longest pause yet. On my ship, Velharath said, and I believe on many ships in this fleet, the officers have begun speaking about your species in a way I have not heard before. Not as an enemy, more as a question, something they cannot solve. Is that bad? I asked. For the Dominion's plans, yes, Velharath said. For the Dominion's officers, I think perhaps no. Some of them are very tired. The channel closed. I sat in the quiet of the communication room and thought about that for a while. Tired. 10,000 years of an empire that never laughed, never bent, never found anything funny in all the vast and strange and ridiculous universe it had spent millennia conquering. And somewhere in that fleet, a logistics coordinator had opened an unauthorized channel to ask me why we sent 40,000 rubber ducks to an alien flagship. On day 15, we sent our formal response. It was 3 sentences long. We declined the terms. We restated our counter-proposal. We expressed genuine interest in continued dialogue and noted that we had very much enjoyed meeting with the Herald and hoped future conversations would be as productive. The Herald received it. There was a silence of 6 hours. Then the Dominion sovereign, speaking from the throne world for the first time, issued a direct order to the fleet. Proceed to bombardment protocols. And the laughter stopped. Part 4. It stopped the way everything real stops, not with a dramatic pause or a musical cue, but with a message on a screen and a shift in posture across every room in the crisis center. I saw Patricia read the intercepted transmission. I watched her face go through several things in the space of about 2 seconds and then go very still. They are moving to bombardment formations, Colonel Harris said from the tactical display. His voice was completely flat, professional, the voice of someone who has spent a career not allowing their voice to carry what they are feeling. Estimated deployment in 4 hours. 4 hours? I had a cup of tea on the desk in front of me. I looked at it. Ordinary tea, slightly too strong because I had left the bag in too long. There was something almost ridiculous about the gap between the tea and the 4 hours. Patricia stood up. Get me every defense coordinator on the planet, she said. Unified channel, 10 minutes. What followed was not, I think, what most people imagine when they think about the moment humanity decided to defend itself. There was no grand speech. No heroic declaration, no single voice rising above the noise to rally the species. What there was, instead, was a very long and extremely fast conversation between approximately 60 people across 12 time zones who had been quietly working on this possibility for 3 weeks and had not told their superiors everything they had prepared, because asking permission in advance is much slower than asking forgiveness afterward. Colonel Harris had been one of them. The defensive network Earth had assembled was not a match for the Dominion fleet in any conventional sense. 4,000 ships, each carrying weapons capable of eliminating small moons, against whatever Earth could put in orbit, was not a fight by any standard military calculation. What we had was not designed to win a conventional exchange. It was designed to make a conventional exchange impossible. The first element was signal disruption. Not the jamming of weapons systems, which we could not do, but the jamming of targeting systems. The frequency work our engineers had done over the previous weeks, riding the Dominion's own communications infrastructure, had given them a detailed map of how the fleet's targeting network communicated. They could not shut it down, but they could introduce noise. Targeted, specific, surgical noise that made every targeting solution drift by just enough to be unreliable without being so far off that the system flagged an error. It was the technical equivalent of bumping someone's elbow right as they tried to write their name. The result is illegible. The hand does not know it was bumped. The second element was what Colonel Harris called the confusion layer, and what he briefed to Patricia as a multi-platform cognitive disruption initiative. And what it actually was an idea from a retired naval officer named George, who had spent the last 30 years designing escape rooms for a living. George had been brought in 3 weeks ago as part of an unofficial creative consultation group that Harris had quietly assembled, and just as quietly kept off the official personnel roster. George's idea was very simple. If you cannot fight an enemy's weapons, fight their decision-making. Introduce so many simultaneous small anomalies into their operational environment that their command structure spends more time processing what is happening than issuing orders. He had designed rooms for a decade that trapped people not with locks but with information, with too many things to look at, too many possibilities to evaluate, too many small wrong things to ignore. He had a plan for the Dominion fleet that applied the same principle at planetary scale. I will not describe the full technical details because I understood approximately 40% of them at the time and have not improved much since. What I can describe is the effect. At the moment the Dominion fleet began moving into bombardment formation, every automated drone in the fleet received a simultaneous rerouting signal. Not the gentle redirect we had used for the supply drones. A complete override. 412 drones began moving in patterns that made no navigational sense, crossing each other's paths, grouping in formations that resembled constellations, and in 3 cases, docking with ships they were not assigned to and presenting routine maintenance, requests that the receiving ship systems accepted and began processing. Simultaneously, the fleet's internal communication network, which we had been quietly mapping for 15 days, received 17,000 small messages. Each message was a routine system notification of the type the fleet's administrative network generated automatically. Maintenance alerts, atmospheric readings, supply confirmators. Individually, each one was completely normal. All 17,000 arriving in a 30-second window was not normal, but was also not clearly an attack, and the fleet's monitoring systems had to evaluate each one individually before categorizing it. This took 9 minutes. During those 9 minutes, the bombardment order was relayed 4 times internally, and each time was caught in the processing queue behind a maintenance notification for an air recycler in cargo, Bay 7 of Vessel 44. It was not much. 9 minutes is not a long time by any measure, but 9 minutes was enough for a transmission to get through. It came from Vel Hareth. Not to me this time, to the fleet's general channel, An unauthorized broadcast that overrode the command encryption for 40 seconds before it was shut down. 40 seconds of a secondary logistics coordinator from Vessel 12 saying, in the Dominion's own language, with the fleet's own vocabulary, something that none of their rule books had a response protocol for. "We are making a mistake," Velhareth said. "This species is not what the doctrine describes. They are not afraid of us. They are not performing bravery or performing madness. They are simply not responding to us the way any species has ever responded, and we have chosen to interpret that as deficiency, because deficiency is the category we have. But listen to what we are doing. We are about to destroy a world because it sent us a yellow rubber object and asked if the time was measured in Earth hours or Dominion hours. I am asking you, is that the mission we signed for?" 40 seconds, then silence. The bombardment order sat in the processing queue for another 6 minutes before it cleared. By that time, Harris had 3 of our orbital platforms in position. Not weapons, exactly. Each platform contained a tight-focused signal emitter of a type that had originally been designed for deep space communication experiments. At short range, against the specific sensor frequencies the Dominion targeting systems used, they created a reflection pattern that made each platform appear, on enemy scanners, to be approximately 40 vessels. We had 3 platforms. The Dominion's targeting network was now reading 120 threat signatures. The fleet paused. This is the moment I think about most when I look back. Not the noise or the drone patterns or Velhareth's 40 seconds. The pause. Because what it meant, underneath all the tactical language, was that the Dominion fleet had spent 10,000 years building systems for situations where the enemy behaved predictably, and they had just encountered a situation where nothing was behaving predictably, and the answer they had for that situation was to stop and look around. Which is, in the end, a very sane response. It was also exactly what we needed. The pause lasted 19 minutes. In those 19 minutes, the targeting queue cleared and cleared again, and 2 of the automated drone formations had drifted into a configuration that the fleet's navigational system was flagging as a potential collision risk, which required manual override authorization from 3 different command levels, and the officer responsible for one of those authorization levels was currently trying to file an incident report about an air recycler in cargo Bay 7 of Vessel 44. Patricia used those 19 minutes to open every communication channel she had. She reached the Herald on the 4th try. "We would like to talk," she said. "Not about terms, not about submission, just to talk before anything else happens." The Herald looked at her through the screen for a long time. "Supreme Command has issued bombardment orders," it said. But it said it the way a person says something they are testing the weight of, not the way a person says something they are committed to. "We know," Patricia said, "and we know you can carry them out. We are asking you not to. 15 minutes. That is all we are asking for. 15 minutes." I could see something moving in the Herald's expression. Something I had never seen there before in all the video footage and all the meetings. Something that was not authority and was not contempt. Something that looked, if I had to name it, like a person deciding something that they were going to have to explain to their superiors afterward. 15 minutes, the Herald said. The bombardment order was suspended. Harris leaned over and said, very quietly, "What do we say in 15 minutes?" "The truth," Patricia said. "We tell them the actual truth." Which was this. We are not a difficult species. We are not a defiant species in the way your records define defiance. We are a species that has been through a great deal and come out the other side still functioning, and the mechanism we developed for that survival is humor. We find the frightening thing funny because laughter is how we metabolize fear without being consumed by it. We sent you rubber ducks because you frightened us, and our response to fear, built over millennia, is to find something in the situation that makes us feel less small. We are not mocking you. We are coping. And here is the other truth. We do not want to fight you, not because we are afraid of losing, though we understand the odds, but because we have already fought so many things. Disease and hunger and the slow catastrophe of a warming planet and the sharp catastrophe of every war we ever started with each other. We have spent 10,000 years fighting things, and we are genuinely, profoundly tired of it. What we want, what we have always wanted, underneath all the noise, is just to be here, to exist, to keep going. To find out what comes next, we are asking you to let us. The herald did not respond immediately. When it did, it said 3 words. I will relay. The 15 minutes became 4 hours. The 4 hours became a day. The bombardment order was not rescinded technically, but it was not executed. Somewhere on the throne world, the eternal sovereign looked at the report from his fleet and read that a pre-interstellar civilization had disrupted his targeting systems with what appeared to be a reprogrammed maintenance algorithm, neutralized his fear induction device by turning it into popular music, sent his flagship 40,000 toy ducks, and in the moment of the actual bombardment order, had paused the entire operation with a logistics officer asking a question nobody had thought to ask before. And I was told, much later by Velhareth, that the eternal sovereign sat with that report for a very long time. And then, for the first time in a reign that had lasted 1100 years, he laughed. Not a kind laugh, not a generous one, but a real one, a surprised one. The kind that comes when the universe shows you something you had genuinely not expected to see. Part 5. The sovereign's laugh did not end the occupation. Nothing ends that cleanly. History never does. What it did was create a crack in something that had been sealed for a very long time, and through that crack, very slowly, things began to move. The immediate aftermath was an internal Dominion review process that we were not invited to and were not told about, and found out about 6 weeks later when Velhareth told me, in another unauthorized communication, that a formal inquiry had been opened into the performance of the invasion fleet. Not for failing to complete the bombardment, for failing to properly assess the target species before committing to an ultimatum. The Dominion, it turned out, had a very detailed protocol for pre-invasion assessment. It had simply not been followed in Earth's case, because nobody had thought a pre-interstellar species warranted serious evaluation. This was embarrassing by Dominion standards. It was the kind of embarrassment that had consequences. The Herald was reassigned, not punished exactly, but moved to a posting that carried less visibility. The senior strategic analysts who had certified Earth as a standard low-resistance target were placed under review. Several documents were quietly reclassified. And the automated assessment division that had generated Earth's invasion profile was audited, which led to the discovery that it had been running on a logic framework that had not been updated in approximately 400 years, and contained a fundamental assumption that any species without faster-than-light capability was, by definition, unable to resist Dominion authority through any means other than direct military force. It had no category for rubber ducks. It had no category for music remixes. It had no category for a species that found its own potential extinction genuinely funny. The fleet did not leave, not right away. They pulled back to a safer orbital distance, which was presented internally as a tactical repositioning, and was in practice exactly what it sounds like. They were no longer directly overhead in the way that blocked satellite signals and created shadow patterns and drifted into shipping lanes. They were still there, still visible on a clear night as a set of moving points of light that were not stars, but they were no longer a presence that pressed down on every moment of every day. Life on Earth, which had been remarkably normal throughout the entire affair in the way that life tends to be normal because normality is mostly a choice about what to focus on, became slightly more normal. The granola bar had its own documentary now. Donna's alien interference had won a music award. The rubber ducks had been traced, finally, to the intern, whose name was Kevin, and who had received a formal written note of appreciation from Patricia that he had framed and put on his wall. Velhareth and I continued talking. The conversations were not officially sanctioned by either side. They happened in the early hours of the morning, when communications oversight was thinner, on a frequency that sat just far enough outside the standard monitoring bands that it required a specific piece of equipment to access. Equipment that Kevin had quietly built for me in the third week of the occupation from components he had ordered through a supply requisition form he had categorized as office infrastructure. I did not ask him to explain this. Some things are better not fully understood. Velhareth was, I learned over those weeks, something like what humans would call a mid-level bureaucrat, a person who had entered the Dominion's administrative structure young and worked their way to a position of moderate responsibility over a long career, mostly by being careful and reliable and good at logistics, which is to say at knowing how things were supposed to move and what to do when they did not move that way. They were not a revolutionary. They were not a radical. They were a person who had spent a very long career inside a very large system and had slowly developed, with the patience of someone who has no other option, a set of private doubts about whether the system was quite as correct as it presented itself. They had never said any of this to anyone before, not because they were afraid exactly, more because there had never been anyone to say it to. The Dominion was not a place that accommodated uncertainty well. It had answers. It had always had answers. It had answers to questions nobody had thought to ask, and answers to questions it had forbidden anyone from asking. Doubt was not a state the system had room for. Talking to me, apparently, was easier. In the same way that talking to a stranger is sometimes easier than talking to someone who knows you, because the stranger does not carry the weight of your history and cannot be disappointed in a way that costs you anything. I told Velhareth about Earth's history, not the version from encyclopedias, which tends to flatten things into sequences of events, but the texture of it. How we had been to the edge of extinction more than once, by our own hands as often as by anything external. How we had managed to pull back from those edges not through any single heroic act, but through accumulated small decisions made by ordinary people who had decided that one more day was worth the effort. How we had developed, over all of that, a peculiar relationship with catastrophe that was not bravado and was not denial, but was something closer to an understanding that the worst thing is rarely actually the last thing, so you might as well deal with it and see what comes after. Velhareth listened to all of this, then said, on my homeworld before the Dominion absorbed us there was a word. I do not know if it translates. It describes the feeling of looking at something enormous and finding it, despite everything, small enough to bear. I thought about that for a long time. We have something like that, I said. We call it perspective. Is that what the yellow objects were? Velhareth asked. Perspective. Yes, I said, among other things. The formal diplomatic shift happened 5 months after first contact. It was not dramatic. It did not involve ceremonies or speeches or the kind of moment that gets recorded as a turning point. It happened in a series of internal Dominion memos, the existence of which we did not learn about until much later, in which the Strategic Analysis Division completed its review of the Earth assessment failure and recommended, in careful administrative language that avoided assigning blame to anyone still in a position of power, that a new engagement protocol be developed for species that fell outside the existing behavioral classification matrix. The recommendation included, buried in Appendix 7, a subrecommendation that the Earth case be reclassified from active subjugation to exploratory dialogue, and that a formal diplomatic exchange be initiated on terms that did not require Earth to acknowledge Dominion authority as a precondition. The memo was approved. Velhareth told me it was approved because the Sovereign's laugh, the one that had surprised everyone including the Sovereign, had been interpreted by the court as indicating that the Earth situation warranted continued observation. The eternal sovereign did not change his mind about things. He had a reputation to maintain, but he was old, and old authority sometimes finds ways to allow things to shift without appearing to allow them. The herald that arrived for the new round of talks was not the original herald. The new one was shorter, had only 4 arms, and introduced itself with its actual name rather than its title. Its name was something that our translators rendered as either sorrow turning or the light that comes after, depending on which linguistic framework they applied. We asked which it preferred, and it said both were acceptable, which was the first moment in the entire history of our interaction with the Dominion that a Dominion official had expressed a preference that was not a demand. Patricia handled the new talks. I was in the room, officially as note-taker, unofficially because I was by this point incapable of staying away from any conversation that involved the direction this whole thing was going. The talks were different, slower, more careful, but different in the way that matters, which is to say they were actually a conversation rather than a presentation of terms. The light that comes after asked us genuine questions. Not strategic questions dressed up as courtesy, but actual questions about how we had organized our society, why we had so many different languages, what we had thought was out among the stars before we knew. We answered honestly, including the parts that were not flattering, which seemed to surprise the herald more than anything else. "You are describing your own failures," it said at one point, when Patricia was explaining a particularly difficult period in Earth's 20th century. "Voluntarily." "Yes," Patricia said. "How else would you learn from them?" The light that comes after wrote something down with a stylus on a flat surface. This was, Velhareth told me later, very unusual for a herald. Heralds did not take notes. They received information and processed it, and it became part of the record. Writing things down yourself was something you did when you wanted to remember something for personal reasons rather than official ones. It was a small thing. It was the kind of small thing that means everything. 6 weeks into the new talks, the Dominion fleet completed its withdrawal to beyond lunar orbit. This was presented as a scheduled fleet rotation. It was not. But the reason it was presented that way was that the Dominion had no existing mechanism for retreat that did not imply defeat, and the light that comes after had apparently argued, in internal channels, that what was needed was not a retreat but a repositioning, and that if the sovereign approved the withdrawal as a tactical decision rather than a diplomatic one, there was no loss of standing involved. The sovereign approved it. Kevin, who had been monitoring the fleet positions for months, told me at 7 in the morning on a clear day in early spring. I was in my office with the window open and a cup of tea that was the right temperature for once. He came in without knocking, which he had long since stopped apologizing for, and said, "They are past the moon." I looked at the window, at the ordinary sky, at the pale morning light that was just morning light and nothing else. "Thank you, Kevin," I said. "You are welcome," he said and left. I sat with that for a while. The Galactic Accord Council was formed 14 months after first contact. It was not the Dominion's council. That still existed and still operated and still did the things large empires do, which is mostly administer themselves and argue about procedure. The Accord was something smaller and newer and stranger. It had no formal authority. It had no enforcement mechanism. It was, in the most basic structural sense, a conversation. The founding members were Earth, 3 Dominion species that had been under Dominion administration for centuries, and had requested observer status in the Earth talks without authorization, Velhareth's homeworld, which submitted a formal application through channels that technically did not exist yet, and a small civilization from a star system about 40 light-years from Earth that had been watching the entire situation with what we later learned was enormous relief. Because they had been scheduled for Dominion assessment within the next 50 years, and our existence had apparently changed the timeline. The chamber was not enormous. It was functional and carefully arranged to accommodate beings of several different sizes, which required some creative furniture design from a team in Stockholm who had, until that year, specialized in adaptive design for human bodies and found the new parameters genuinely interesting. The lighting was adjusted to a spectrum that was comfortable for the widest range of visual systems present, which left it slightly dimmer than Earth standard and gave everything a quiet, early morning quality that I found unexpectedly peaceful. I sat in a chair that was the right size for once and looked at the 41 beings around the table. Not all of them were happy to be there. Some were cautious. Some were there because their governments had decided, with varying degrees of enthusiasm, that this was worth attending. Some were there the way people attend things when they are not sure it will amount to anything but are not willing to miss it in case it does. A few of them looked at each other with histories I did not know and tensions that predated my species' earliest writing by thousands of years. And some of them, a few, looked at each other with the particular expression that humans have when they find themselves in a room where something is beginning, and they know it is beginning, but cannot yet see what it will become. Velharath sat across from me. They had been formally nominated as the Accord's first non-Earth administrative coordinator, which was a title that had been invented specifically for this occasion, by a committee that had spent 3 weeks arguing about what to call it. They met my eyes and made a small gesture that I had learned to read as the Dominion equivalent of a deep breath before something important. The light that comes after read Earth's formal invitation into the Galactic Accord. It read slowly, with the careful delivery of someone who understands that words in a moment like this are not just words. When it finished, there was a silence. Then someone placed a rubber duck on the speaker's podium. I do not know who brought it. I did not see it happen. It was simply there, small and yellow and slightly ridiculous in the middle of all that weight. Several of the beings present looked at it with expressions that ranged from confusion to what I can only describe as cautious delight. The light that comes after looked at it for a long moment, then looked at me, and something passed across its face that was not quite a human expression, but was close enough to one that I knew what it was. It was the expression of someone finding something unexpectedly funny. It did not laugh. That was, I think, a step that would come later if it came at all. But it looked at the duck, and it looked at me, and it made a note on its personal stylus, the same way it had done in the early talks when Patricia talked about human failure. I thought about Velharath's word, the one that translated as looking at something enormous and finding it small enough to bear. I thought about Donna's music, about 40,000 yellow ducks arriving in a cargo bay, about Kevin's supply requisitions, about the granola bar that had its own documentary. I thought about a species that had been afraid of so many things for so long that it had developed laughter as a survival tool, that had looked at the cold dark of space full of things it did not understand and decided, at some point deep in its shared history, that the appropriate response was to go find out what was out there and see if any of it was funny. And I thought that the universe might be big enough and strange enough and full of enough things that none of us had a category for, that there was room for something new in it. Not a dominion, not a conquest, something more like a very long and complicated conversation, held in a room that was slightly too dim, between beings that barely understood each other, about what it meant to be here and what they wanted to do with the fact of being here. Not an answer, not a conclusion. A beginning. After the session, I walked out of the Accord building onto the surface of Velharath's homeworld. The gravity was slightly lighter than Earth's, which gave every step a faint sense of lift, like walking on the first day after being sick. 3 moons hung in the early evening sky, 2 of them almost full, one a thin crescent near the horizon. The light was amber and gentle. I called my mother. She picked up immediately, which she always does, because she has called me every day since the ships appeared and continues to do so regardless of what time it is on whichever world I happen to be standing on. "How did it go?" she asked. "Well," I said. "Are you eating properly?" I looked at the amber sky, at the moons, at the stars beginning to appear at the edge of the darkening horizon, familiar constellations mixed with stars I did not have names for. "I am working on it," I said. She told me about the neighborhood, about her neighbor's new dog, about a film she had watched that she thought I would like because it was funny without trying too hard, which is the kind of funny she considers the best kind. I listened to all of it. I leaned against the wall of the Accord building and listened to my mother tell me about a dog and a film on a world 40 light years from home under 3 moons, and the universe felt enormous and strange and full of things none of us had categories for. And somehow, because of all of that, it felt exactly the right size. We did not conquer the galaxy. We did not march outward with flags and declarations and the weight of a civilization proving itself. We just showed up the way humans always show up, slightly underprepared, slightly too loud, laughing at things we probably should not be laughing at, and absolutely certain that whatever came next was worth finding out about. The stars had never seen anything quite like it. Honestly, looking back, neither had we. And that, I think, is where every good story starts.